Damos la más cordial bienvenida a la continuación de la serie de webinarios para el fortalecimiento de capacidades en temas Codex de interés para la región de América Latina y el Caribe. Como muchos de ustedes saben, estos seminarios han sido organizados por la Agencia de Regulación y Control y Sanitario de Ecuador, Agrocalidad, en representación de Ecuador como presidente del Comité de Coordinación del Codex para América Latina y el Caribe, CCLAC, y la Oficina Regional de la FAO para América Latina y el Caribe, quienes se unen bajo el proyecto Acciones para apoyar la implementación de textos del Codex para la resistencia a los antimicrobianos, el proyecto ACT, financiado por la República de Corea. La serie de webinarios será mantenida hasta el año 2025 y tiene como propósito socializar y promover la aplicación de los estándares del Codex Alimentarios para el fortalecimiento del sistema de inocuidad de los alimentos en nuestros países. Previo a la CCLAC 2023, realizada en julio de este año, se realizó una encuesta a los países de la región y dos temas fueron elevados. Uno, contaminantes en alimentos, y el segundo, fraude alimentario. Es por eso que para este año, en preparación a la CCLAC 23, en abril realizamos el módulo 6 sobre contaminantes en productos pesqueros y acuícolas, donde pudimos conocer experiencias de distintos expertos del cono sur de nuestra región. Ahora, para compartir los importantes conocimientos entregados durante la CCLAC 23, es que programamos este módulo 7 de fraude alimentario.
Buenos días a todos, gracias por estar presentes esta mañana, me sumo a la bienvenida a esta serie de charlas, gracias a todos los participantes que ya nos acompañan y espero que sigan aumentando, lo que es una gran alegría para todos por la importancia del Codex en la región. Antes de empezar, quisiera darles una pequeña introducción de lo que es el fraude alimentario. El fraude alimentario se califica como un desafío global transnacional con un potencial considerable de riesgo en materia de inocuidad alimentaria que puede afectar la salud del consumidor, así como su confianza en el suministro de alimentos, dar lugar a pérdidas de alimentos y desigualdades entre los actores del mercado y dañar la economía agroalimentaria. Es una nueva esfera que requiere una cuidadosa consideración y regulación. En el Codex, el fraude alimentario se define como cualquier acción deliberada para engañar a otros en cuanto a las especificaciones prescritas o características, características esperadas de los alimentos para obtener una ventaja económica injusta. Las cadenas de suministro alimentario son cada vez más globalizadas y complejas, lo que las hace vulnerables al fraude alimentario. El avance en técnicas analíticas, el aumento del conocimiento sobre la inocuidad alimentaria y las respuestas globales a incidentes recientes destacan la necesidad de implementar un sistema que refuerce la resiliencia de los sistemas agroalimentarios, abordando colectivamente el problema y minimizando riesgos y oportunidades de fraude. Para conversar sobre este tema, contamos con la presencia de 3 expertos en inocuidad de los alimentos de la sede de la Organización de las Naciones Unidas para la Alimentación y Agricultura, en Roma. Ellos son Eleonora Dupoy, Esther Garrido y Temu Viniqueñi, quienes nos contarán sobre el fraude alimentario desde el Codex, el sector acuícola y pesquero y desde el enfoque regulatorio. Al término de cada intervención tendremos un espacio de preguntas y de respuestas donde podrán levantar la mano y se les otorgará la palabra. De igual manera pueden escribir sus consultas en el chat que les estaremos nosotras leyendo. Les recordamos que este webinario está siendo grabado para poder luego compartir este material con ustedes y con las personas que no nos han podido acompañar esta mañana. Muchas gracias. Ángeles, puedes continuar con la presentación de Leonora.
Muchas gracias, Evelyn. Entonces, ya para iniciar la presentación de nuestros panelistas, iniciaremos con la doctora Eleonora Dupoy, oficial de inocuidad y calidad alimentaria de FAO desde el año 2009. Sus principales áreas de trabajo se refieren a la promoción y el apoyo al diálogo político mundial y regional sobre nuevos temas de inocuidad de los alimentos, el fortalecimiento de los sistemas nacionales de control de los alimentos sobre la base de análisis de riesgos, incluida la preparación para gestionar la respuesta de emergencia en materia de inocuidad de los alimentos, y la mejora de las capacidades institucionales para la participación efectiva en el trabajo del Codex Alimentario. La doctora Dupoy dirigió el desarrollo de las prioridades estratégicas de la FAO para la inocuidad de los alimentos dentro del marco estratégico de la FAO 2022-2031. Además, forma parte de la Secretaría de Infosan en la FAO y representa a la FAO en el STDF. Antes de incorporarse a la FAO, nuestra panelista trabajó en el mundo académico como jefa del Departamento de Ciencias de los Alimentos y Nutrición, dirigiendo la reforma y modernización del Plan de Estudios Universitarios en la enseñanza, la inocuidad de los alimentos y la nutrición. Eleonora nos presentará sobre el estatus actual del trabajo del Codex en fraude alimentario. Entonces agradecemos a nuestra primera panelista, Eleonora. El piso es todo suyo.
Muchas gracias, Maria. Distinguished participants, dear colleagues, good morning. I am pleased to greet you all on behalf of Agri-Food Systems and Food Safety Division of FAO. I apologize, I will present this presentation, this topic in English. So, food fraud. Yeah. Now it's important to move. Okay. Food fraud, as was mentioned by Evelyn, is any deliberate practice intended to deceive others in regard to characteristics of food to gain an unfair economic advantage. This is the definition which is included, proposed in the draft Codex guideline on the prevention and control of food fraud, which currently is under preparation within the Codex Committee of Food Import, Export and Certification Systems. Food fraud is a global challenge. There is no country in all development spectrum from low income, middle income, and high income, which would not face the phenomenon of food fraud. Food fraud is as old as agriculture, food processing, and trade are. And as I mentioned, there is no country who for the moment is free of food fraud, and we all have to join forces, knowledge and tools in order to counteract this phenomenon, which is damaging economies, which is bringing also damage to the health of consumers. Several high profile food fraud incidents in the recent past. For example, the melamine contamination of milk products in China in 2008, which resulted in 54,000 babies hospitalized and 6 deaths, or the horse meat scandal, which happened in Europe in 2013, or let's take methanol poisoning through the adulterated alcohol beverages, have shown that food fraud is not only a food quality matter, but also is a risk for food safety and is a risk for consumer health. It may affect trust in food supply and can result in economic losses for food businesses, and also is damaging both for consumers from economic and maybe public health perspective, and also for those food business operators who are honest, who are legitimate players in food supply. In the increasingly globalized food supply with more diverse food traded and more complex food supply chains, the fraud methods are becoming also more complex and more difficult to identify. And there is interest in defining food fraud. There is interest in strategies, in methodologies, in tools to minimize food fraud opportunities and risk, and to build agri-food system resilient to food fraud. Such drivers as trade globalization, lengthening of food supply chain, rapidly developing technological change, new foods and new production methods and new distribution methods, informal economies are likely to increase the incidence of food fraud. So countries face also both similar and common and also unique challenges to food fraud. And there is need in standards, there is need in terminology, in uniform, in harmonized terminology, in definitions, in order to speak the same language in this when speaking about food fraud. And there is also need for more data to establish estimates of actual prevalence of food fraud. Food fraud is linked with food identity and food quality, and Codex has food identity standards for many of food products which are targeted by fraudsters, such as honey, standards for olive oil or milk and milk products. Food fraud may have a food safety risk for consumers, and there are a variety of tools and approaches to tackle food fraud, both in control and mitigation measures within the national food control systems, and also legal, technical, analytical tools, awareness of best counteracting practices. Food fraud is an emerging regulatory area, and currently food fraud is on the agenda of the Codex Alimentarius Commission, which is a member-based intergovernmental body, a special food standards program established by the FAO and the World Health Organization to protect consumer health and promote fair practices in food trade. Codex Alimentarius has dual aspect. On one hand, it is a process. The Codex Alimentarius Commission, the Secretariat, convenes members and observers in meetings to develop standards. Currently, there are 189 members, including 188 countries and one organization, the European Union. And there are also 240 observers in Codex, representing United Nations organizations, international governmental organizations, non-governmental organizations. And what is important to know is the development of Codex standards is 100% member-driven. It is members who decide what subjects they need to regulate and to initiate new work, like in this case, the guidelines on prevention and control of food fraud. As I said, on one side, Codex Alimentarius, when we say Codex Alimentarius, this is a process, a standard setting process, and on the other side, it is the result of this standard setting process. Codex Alimentarius is also a code, a food code, a collection of standards, guidelines, and codes of practice which derived from this consultative and joint work of countries on the platform of Codex Alimentarius committees. There are 8 steps in the elaboration of Codex standards, which starts with a discussion paper, then follows with development, elaboration with a project document, which is submitted for critical review and approval of new work by the Codex Alimentarius Commission, followed by the discussion in several rounds of the prepared draft standards, and in the end, the prepared draft of standards is submitted for the approval by Codex Alimentarius Commission. In the next slides, I will introduce briefly the history of discussion on food fraud, on the developing guidance on food fraud, which is currently ongoing in Codex Alimentarius. The initiation of the standard work on food fraud started in 2016 in the Codex Committee on Food Import, Export and Certification Systems, when the Islamic Republic of Iran presented a conference room document in which it was drawn attention on the rise of food fraud and the need to develop methodologies and possibly Codex guidelines with a global application to help competent authorities to fight and to prevent and counteract this phenomenon. CCFX recognized that food integrity, authenticity was a very difficult problem to tackle and may require more attention from Codex. And many countries confirmed that they face various forms of food fraud, while analytical methods for detection and to help food authorities to detect the food fraud often were either missing or not widely available. The CCFX 22 agreed to develop a discussion paper by Iran with assistance from the Netherlands and Canada for the next session, CCFX 2023, noting possible overlaps, connection with other already existing Codex texts in which food fraud has been addressed. And to show how food authenticity, integrity was covered in this already existing text and from CCFX, from Codex Committee on Food Import, Export and Certification System, but also in the text standards produced by Codex Committee on Food Labeling. So in the next session, which happened in 2017, it was a discussion about definition, scope of work, and it was clarified what are the gaps which the new standard, new guideline would cover, and recognizing also the need to look at the triangulation and to look at those standards which exist on commodities and on relevant standards on labeling, on method of analysis and sampling, and to consult, of course, Codex Alimentarius Commission. The next session of CCFX in 2018 recognized that CCFX Codex may have a role to play in food fraud area, and recognized that a horizontal guidance would help competent authority to counteract food fraud. It was also discussed what further value would be added by the new work by CCFX, and it was decided to further refine the review of gaps within the existing Codex text and rework the definitions. In 2021, it was a meeting which was held virtually due to COVID at that time condition, streamlined the content of potential new work, and this committee, the session discussed the definition. They looked at the roles and responsibility of industry, of food business operators and competent authorities, and on guidance on modernizing national food control systems to address food fraud, and discussed about tools and technology that can be used by competent authorities to detect food fraud. In 2023, last year, in the CCFX 26, there were discussed such topics like, is it or not important to include in the guidance geographic indication issues? And also it was discussed if to include or not feed for food-producing animals. It means food fraud related to feed for food-producing animals. A revision have been made for initial part of the text on definitions, and also it was ensured the alignment with principles and guidelines for national food control systems. In the end, it was decided to return the draft at step 2 so that an electronic working group could address all questions and comments which have been provided by member countries which participated in the meeting or presented their comments in written form. So what is the current status? The current status, just this month, at the beginning of the month, it was held the 27th session of CCFIX, which discussed the scope of the guidance, and it was decided in particular to exclude the matter of the reference to geographic indication food which are covered by intellectual properties. And in case if some countries would be interested to track the food fraud related to geographic indication food, they can do that, of course, following their national legislation and considering the national context. Also, it was excluded the reference to prosecution matters, again, because this falls under criminal law. It's not under the remit of Codex standards. And it was decided to give further consideration how reference or mentioning how, let's say, reference to feed is reflected in the guidance. They were also revisited and refined the definitions and also roles and responsibilities of competent authorities, food business operators, and have been made some editorials and semantic improvements. In conclusion, the CCFIX 27 decided to forward the draft guidelines on prevention and control on food fraud to Codex Alimentarius Commission for adoption at step 5. Thus, currently, the member countries, are preparing for participation in November this year in the 47 meeting of Codex Alimentarius Commission. And in the meantime, the electronic working group composed by United States, China, European Union, Iran, Panama, and UK, and working in English and Spanish, will address all comments which have been received in CCFIX 27. They will be preparing the draft guidelines with consideration of discussion in CCFIX 27 and submit to the Codex Committee, to the Executive Codex Committee for critical review and to Codex Alimentarius Commission for adoption at step 5. So this is the latest movement, let's say, discussion happened in relation to with the guidelines. I will remind that the 8 steps of Codex standards elaboration are on this slide, and as you see, after this step 5, if countries will have comments, again it will be submitted for let's say improvement and for CC Exec and CAC to be approved at the step 8. It depends, so how process will go. I would further present in brief the content of the draft guidelines. So the content is the following: consists of scope, which mentions that the purpose of these guidelines is to provide a specific guidance in addition to guidance which are provided by other Codex texts to competent authorities and food business operators to detect, prevent, mitigate, and control food fraud, including as appropriate feed for food-producing animals. As I mentioned before, intellectual property issues are not included in the scope of this guidance. There are definitions of food fraud, food integrity, and food authenticity given in these draft guidelines, which are mentioned in square brackets because they will be revisited. They are not final. They will be further solved for the final version. In the draft guidelines also mentions the types of food fraud and examples, broad examples, or underlying that this the food fraud is made what is done intentionally for economic gain, such as addition, substitution, dilution, counterfeiting, misrepresentation, concealment. That all these type of food fraud are defined, are given explanation, what does it mean and how to recognize them. The principles which are advised to countries to lead their work in food fraud is to have measures in place proportionate to the level of risk. So it should be sanctions elaborated, and this has to be reflected in the respective legislation. And also it is mentioned that it's very important cooperation among competent authorities within a country, but also between countries, and also cooperation with food business operators, with industry. So national food control systems should have measures in place to detect, prevent, mitigate, and control food fraud, including surveillance and monitoring activities of food supply chain. As the guidance specifies role and responsibilities for competent authorities, which has to derive or to decide their measures, their risk management measures based on risk, and to consider also the circumstances that exist in their territory, and also the risks associated with imported food. In particular, it is advised to establish control in national, so official control by legal structures, and also to establish requirements to prevent, detect, mitigate, and control food fraud, establish oversight programs, develop mechanisms, platforms to detect food fraud, communicate, coordinate, and collaborate with other competent authorities within and between countries, with industry, academia, and other stakeholders, and also to notify and potentially impacted countries with food fraud, either already identified or suspected. Food business operators also has a role to play and has responsibility in standing and counteracting food fraud. And in particular, every food business operator should analyze and understand vulnerability in supply chain, in their products, in the ingredients with which they are working for, and understand the vulnerability, the susceptibility to food fraud of all ingredients and products they are, let's say, working with. Have measures in place to prevent, detect, mitigate, and control the risk that ingredients are not authentic and ensure accurate labeling of their products. Have processes in place for rapid removal of affected food from the market. Inform about suspicion or about the detected food fraud, the competent authorities to inform as soon as possible. And also have, as I mentioned, withdrawal processes and create awareness and understanding of food fraud in all staff of their enterprises. So what activities are listed or are mentioned in the draft guidelines? Such activities like national food control authorities, national food control systems would have to, and competent authorities will have to review their legal requirements, such as laws, regulation, guidance, policies, procedures, sanctions, food business operator responsibilities, and establish procedures also to receive and evaluate reports on food fraud, determining the appropriate follow-up consistent to the risk which the food fraud present to consumers and to food business operators, and have tools to protect those who are reporting food fraud incidents. Establish surveillance activities, both routine and also in response to a specific risk identified in like emergency situation. It's mentioned that the measures should be risk-based, transparent, and also when planning all food safety measures, they should risk-based. Provide the competent authorities should work with food business operators and other stakeholders, providing them guidance and including also access to tools such as standards, analytical methods. Establish channels of communication with other governments, with academic stakeholders for information or exchange of knowledge, of experience in order to combat food fraud. And also alert other competent authorities on food fraud with potential for food safety and public health risk. Then there are also mentioned in the area of collaboration, cooperation, collaboration, and exchange of information. It is stressed that this should be done as early as possible. Even incomplete information should be transmitted, mentioning that the updates will be provided as soon available. And also to ensure that the information, the initial information shared will allow also to evaluate the risk and mitigate the impact without jeopardizing investigation. Enhance collaboration and food fraud prevention by using digital technologies in food chain, and establish information exchange routes with enforcement bodies. So with this, in the nutshell, I presented what was the process of developing the draft Codex guidelines and also the content what this guideline includes, and you can visit the website of Codex Committee of Food Import, Export and Certification System, and download and read all the materials, including the report in which is reflected the discussion which countries carried out in the meeting, and the draft guideline itself. In the next slide, it is presented in nutshell, reminding that the national food control system have measures and have tools and support to counteract food fraud, which consist in Codex, other Codex text existing already, such as a code of ethics, labeling, traceability, certificates, also the guidance on the information exchange between trading countries, then guidelines on rejections, guidelines on information to be exchanged in emergencies, voluntary third-party assurance schemes, all commodity in identity text, and also not the least, it's important to look at the principle and guidelines of national food control systems. FAO support the Codex and national food control system in a number of ways. For example, the Codex Secretariat is hosted by FAO at headquarters, and together with World Health Organization, FAO is funding the work of Codex Alimentarius Commission, Codex Secretariat, and also is providing technical collaboration. FAO is providing, together with WHO, scientific advice through the joint JECFA, GEMRA, GMPR. These are joint expert meetings in food additives, in microbiological risk assessment, in pesticides residues, and also is funding together with WHO the work of this joint expert meeting. FAO has also a capacity development program to help countries in response to the direct demand. FAO is delivering capacity development on demand basis. So if country has a problem and would like the FAO to come with a project to solve a problem, this should be addressed, the demand should be addressed in written, signed at the level of minimum of deputy of minister of health or agriculture or trade or economy. It depends who is raising the matter, and should be addressed to FAO through the country office and the regional office. And for your information, FAO is conducting, assisting countries to support, implement the use of FAO food control system assessment tool. Currently, there are some 20 countries involved. It means that this tool is applied in order to identify what are the gaps in the operation of food control systems, and in the end, there are priorities identified, and there are strategies elaborated how to strengthen food control systems. FAO is also guided in its action by the strategic priorities for food safety within the FAO strategic framework 2231. And these strategic priorities have 4 outcomes. One is oriented to food safety governance and support of Codex Alimentarius, support of intersectoral and multi-stakeholder collaboration on One Health approach basis at all levels of governance. Second outcome is devoted to scientific advice as a foundation for food safety decision making. The third outcome is strengthening national food control system, so we have a strong program in this area. And the fourth outcome of our food safety strategy is to promote private and public collaboration along the entire agri-food systems. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention. And if you have questions, please be free to raise. Thank you. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Eleonora, por esa presentación y por compartir con nosotros en cuál es el estado del tema de fraude alimentario en el Codex y conocer también un adelanto, ¿cierto?, de cuál es la participación de cada uno de los involucrados en la cadena de producción de alimentos. No veo preguntas en el chat, por lo tanto, si tenemos un par de minutitos para, si alguien quiere levantar su mano y hacer alguna consulta, si no, también lo podemos hacer al final de este webinario. Y mientras tanto, veo a Blanca Cristina, buenos días, ¿cómo estás? Comentarles que ya pasamos las 100 personas asistiendo a este webinario, así que muchas gracias por acompañarnos el día de hoy. Blanca Cristina, por favor, adelante.
Gracias, buenos días, María y Eleonora, muchas gracias por la presentación. Ya llevamos bastantes años planteando el plan de inspección, vigilancia y control de alimentos en Colombia y pues conocemos los documentos de evaluación de los sistemas de control de alimentos. Entonces, pues como lo acabas de plantear, nos gustaría realmente tener el apoyo de la FAO para mirar si podemos hacer esa evaluación y partiendo de esa evaluación, pues podríamos seguir adelante con el plan de control de alimentos. Gracias.
Yes, thank you very much for for this question. As I mentioned, the technical support provided to countries is based in response to the demand. So it is important in this case to address the demand for support to assess the national food control systems, and then the process of mobilizing the support is launched, and it is decided, and if funds are available, then the technical collaboration, technical assistance projects are deployed. You may know that currently the Chile applied the FAO National Food Control System Assessment tool has been done, and we heard feedback that it was very useful for policymakers to understand where the weaknesses are and to appropriately and based on evidence to continue strengthening their food control system. Thank you.
Bueno, agradecemos entonces a Blanca Cristina y a Leonora por estas últimas intervenciones. Leonora, muchas gracias de nuevo por su presentación. Evelyn, te dejo nuevamente la palabra. No, Evelyn, no te escuchamos.
We don't.
Ya. No. Si quieres, mientras tanto, para no perder minutos, hago yo la presentación y retomamos al final, ¿te parece? Bueno, entonces con eso yo hago la presentación de nuestra siguiente panelista, Esther Garrido, quien es oficial de pesca y trabaja para la División de Pesca y Acuicultura de la Organización de las Naciones Unidas para la Alimentación y Agricultura, FAO, en Roma, Italia. Ha trabajado en la prestación de asesoramiento científico para apoyar el establecimiento de estándares internacionales como los establecidos por el Codex Alimentarios para la inocuidad y calidad de los productos pesqueros y acuícolas durante 13 años. Durante este periodo, Esther ha brindado apoyo técnico a programas y proyectos de cooperación para mejorar la situación de inocuidad alimentaria del sector pesquero y acuícola en muchas zonas del mundo. Previo a su experiencia en FAO, trabajó para el sector privado en la industria alimentaria en producción, inocuidad y gestión de calidad de los alimentos, y también en la certificación de inocuidad y calidad de los alimentos para el Departamento Agroalimentario de un organismo de certificación internacional, donde trabajó con diferentes esquemas de certificación. Esther es doctora en ciencias, licenciada en nutrición humana y dietética, y también en ciencias y tecnología de los alimentos, y cuenta con un magíster en calidad alimentaria. Muchas gracias, Esther, por estar el día de hoy con nosotros. La dejamos adelante con su presentación.
Muchas gracias, María, y buenos días a toda la audiencia desde Roma. Y ante todo, pues eso, bueno, muchísimas gracias por invitarme a estar aquí hoy con todos. Yo vengo a presentarles la situación en la que se encuentra el sector de la pesca y la acuicultura con respecto al fraude alimentario. Em, a lo largo de la presentación, pues, no pasa, ahora sí. A lo largo de la presentación, pues se pondrán algunos estudios de caso, digamos, ejemplos de los problemas más comunes en la industria, así como algunas recomendaciones y algunas herramientas para combatirlo. Me gustaría, bueno, destacar algo muy importante, y es que los productos procedentes de la pesca y la acuicultura son especialmente vulnerables al fraude. Y pues la Interpol, por ejemplo, lo sitúa como la tercera categoría de alimentos con mayor riesgo de sufrir fraude, y la Comisión Europea como la segunda categoría con mayor riesgo de sufrir fraude. Y pensemos, por qué ocurre esto? Bueno, pues porque primero hay más de una autoridad competente involucrada en la inocuidad alimentaria del producto de pesca y acuicultura. La situación se vuelve aún más complicada cuando hablamos de fraude en el sector, ya que además aparecen más autoridades a considerar y a coordinar. A veces hay lagunas, a veces hay duplicidad, y esto pues genera una situación muy confusa. También pues el desconocimiento sobre la taxonomía de las especies hace más vulnerable al sector. Y bueno, la gran diferencia que hay a veces entre especies que son muy parecidas, o entre productos que provienen de la misma especie pero con métodos de producción distintos. Estamos hablando de especies de captura salvaje o de acuicultura. Y por último, bueno, pues cabe destacar temas relacionados con la pesca ilegal y no reportada y no reglamentada, que también juega un papel aquí, así como las debilidades en la trazabilidad de los productos de la pesca, que a veces se hace muy complicada. Están, si buscamos casos de fraude alimentario y abrimos los journals, los periódicos, las digitales, cualquier informe que sale sobre fraude alimentario, los productos de la pesca están prácticamente siempre ahí. Aquí traigo un pantallazo del último, por ejemplo, que se hacen informes mensuales de la Comisión Europea sobre fraude alimentario y adulteración, y los dos primeros pues ya mencionan atún, por ejemplo, o pescado sin determinar congelado.
Disculpa,
Hay varios...
perdón,
Sí, dime.
perdón que interrumpa. Lo que pasa es que la presentación está en modo moderador y no pantalla completa. No hay ningún problema, pero si quieres modificar ese detalle.
A ver, voy a volver a compartir. ¿Ahora?
Sigue en modo moderador, pero si no es problema para ti, se ve bien, de todas formas. Era solo para comentarte.
A ver,
Es que creo que estás con dos pantallas, ¿no? Puede ser
un
eso
momento que voy a...
a cambiar de pantalla.
sí, a ver, perdón
No,
por
tranquila, no
la
pasa nada.
inconveniencia.
A todos nos
Em,
pasa.
Ángeles, tal vez me puedes confirmar si me escuchas ahí.
Sí, te escucho perfecto.
Ya, perfecto, gracias.
Gracias.
em, ¿Se ve ahora,
Ahora está
María?
perfecto. Sí,
Ahora está
perfecto.
perfecto. Muy bien,
Muchas
muchas
gracias.
gracias. Muchas gracias. Bueno, pues como mencionaba, hay dos recursos que me gustaría destacar, de los que han sido elaborados por nuestro departamento, por nuestra división, la División de Pesca y Acuicultura de la FAO. El primero es un informe que salió en 2018, que es una especie de resumen de lo que supone el fraude en nuestro sector, lo pone en perspectiva con respecto a otros sectores. Y el segundo, que si todo va bien se publicará este año, es un informe que destaca por los últimos desarrollos en temas de fraude alimentario y presenta algunos estudios de caso de nuestro sector y herramientas para combatirlo. Y aquí voy a explicar yo algunos de estos estudios de caso de forma breve para, bueno, resumir qué es lo que suele pasar en nuestro sector, ¿no? Por un lado, vamos a presentar estudios de casos relacionados con el etiquetado incorrecto y la sustitución de especies. También estudios de casos relacionados con la sustitución de producto fresco con congelado, la falsificación de origen geográfico, la adición de agua y otros ingredientes y, bueno, pues la adición también de sustancias que pueden esconder la alteración del producto. Con respecto al etiquetado incorrecto de sustitución de especies, pues se me ocurrió traer este ejemplo del informe de Oceana de 2016, en el que se revisaron más de 200 estudios de fraude en el sector pesquero en más de 55 países. Y el resultado fue pues, que el 20% del pescado, tanto de venta al por menor como de catering, pues estaba mal etiquetado, que es un porcentaje pues, bastante alarmante. Y algunos ejemplos de productos mal etiquetados pues fueron el red snapper, el mahi mahi, el grouper, el salmón, el pez espada, mucho, mucho atún también. Pero vamos, realmente se encontraron pues todo tipo de especies. Este mismo estudio pues, destacaba que en Brasil, por ejemplo, los investigadores analizaron unas 63 muestras de bagre, conocido localmente como suribim, y descubrieron que el 80% estaban mal etiquetados. Los filetes de pescado siempre tienen más probabilidades de estar mal etiquetados que el pescado entero, por supuesto. Luego hubo otro estudio también en Brasil que destacó que el 55% de 45 muestras etiquetadas como tiburón pues fueron identificadas como pez sierra de dientes grandes, que es una especie en peligro crítico de extinción cuya venta está prohibida en Brasil. El etiquetado ambiguo de estos productos del mar pues es un enorme vacío legal que permite vender en el mercado pescado ilegal y en peligro de extinción. Y otro de los estudios pues, destacó que los productos etiquetados como atún y lubina resultaron ser tiburón. El tiburón es un pescado, como ya la mayoría sabemos aquí, dada la audiencia, con un alto contenido en mercurio y que las personas sensibles a la ingestión de mercurio pues, deben evitar, incluidas pues, bueno, mujeres embarazadas y lactantes. Y esto me lleva a el siguiente punto, y es que estos problemas, este tipo de fraude, pues nos puede llevar a tener problemas de inocuidad alimentaria. Tiene implicaciones para la inocuidad alimentaria, no solamente con respecto a metales pesados, como hemos mencionado con el tema del tiburón, pero también, por ejemplo, cuando hablamos de toxinas. Se ha dado incluso la intoxicación de gente por consumir pufferfish o bueno, la utilización también incorrecta de productos como por ejemplo la tilapia que se ha consumido de forma cruda, cuando no se debe consumir de forma cruda, ¿no? Cuando se ha vendido como otro producto que sí que puede estar presente en productos como el sushi o ceviche y demás, ¿no? Bueno, pues herramientas, cómo combatir el etiquetado incorrecto y la sustitución de especies. Pues con buenos sistemas de trazabilidad, con un buen conocimiento de la taxonomía, con un marco regulatorio sin fisuras, con un sistema de inspección consistente y con técnicas analíticas de código de barras de ADN. Esto de buenos sistemas de trazabilidad, un marco regulatorio sin fisuras y un sistema de inspección consistente es una herramienta que se puede utilizar para cualquier tipo de fraude de todos los casos de estudio que vamos a mencionar de aquí en adelante, con lo cual no lo voy a ir repitiendo a pesar de que está en cada diapositiva. Pero esto es key para todos los casos de estudio. Algunas herramientas que tenemos nosotros aquí en la división. Bueno, pues aquí tenemos herramientas que nos permiten la identificación de las especies, ¿no? Tú, digamos que buscas por especies y te salen ellas por grupos taxonómicos, de tal forma que que sea más fácil identificar ciertas especies. Esto es algo que es muy simple, es económico y nos evita en determinadas situaciones tener que llevar a cabo análisis que son recursos pues, muy costosos. Bueno, otro caso es importante de fraude, la sustitución de producto fresco con producto descongelado. Em, Realmente las preferencias de los consumidores por el pescado fresco se basan en caracterizaciones sensoriales, ya que pueden ocurrir alteraciones del sabor, del olor, de la consistencia, del color de la carne durante la congelación, durante el almacenamiento, durante el congelado, durante la descongelación. Y esto hace que el pescado fresco sea más caro que el pescado congelado, lo que crea oportunidades para el fraude al sustituir pescado fresco por pescado congelado o descongelado para generar mayores ganancias. Las implicaciones, bueno, pues son mayormente organolépticas, pero también es verdad que la actividad enzimática y microbiológica pues puede aumentar drásticamente después de la muerte. La congelación ralentiza estos procesos, sin embargo, un almacenamiento y una manipulación inadecuado pues podría provocar un aumento del crecimiento bacteriano, especialmente de pseudomonas o lactobacillus, y además olores desagradables debido a la degradación de los aminoácidos, ¿no? Herramientas que se pueden utilizar, pues aparte de todas las ya mencionadas anteriormente, pues herramientas analíticas como la espectroscopía, los métodos enzimáticos, electroforesis, degradación del ADN, la medida de la composición volátil, también el estudio de la morfología y situación organoléptica, el estudio de la actividad microbiológica o la combinación de algunas de las técnicas. La presentación errónea del método de producción. El caso de los productos del mar de piscifactoría versus los de captura silvestre. Bueno, pues hemos visto muy numerosos casos de fraude debido a esto. La palma de los casos se la lleva el salmón atlántico, salmón salar, o la trucha arcoíris, que se vende como salmón del Pacífico. Y hay técnicas analíticas basadas en el ADN, pero también técnicas cromatográficas y de espectroscopía que nos pueden ayudar a mejorar la identificación de estos tipos de fraude. Los riesgos en ocasiones para la inocuidad alimentaria son distintos. Si estamos hablando, por ejemplo, de especies silvestres, no nos vamos a encontrar residuos antibióticos. Y si estamos hablando de especies silvestres, pues a lo mejor tenemos que mirar otro tipo de riesgos, ¿no? y de peligros. Entonces, esto también pues, es importante desde el punto de vista de la inocuidad alimentaria. Y la falsificación de origen geográfico, que también hemos visto a lo largo de los años, que es un problema en el sector, ya que pues, bueno, pues hemos visto que hay denominaciones de origen que a lo mejor pues, son muy, digamos, específicas, que tienen un criterio ya muy establecido y luego tienen una producción muy pequeña y luego vemos grandes cantidades en el mercado. Esto es importante, ya no tanto en este caso desde el punto de vista de la inocuidad alimentaria, pero sí que supone un fraude económico bastante importante, y además de las técnicas analíticas basadas en el ADN y en el análisis de isótopos que podemos utilizar, pues hay otras técnicas bastante sencillas y mucho más económicas, como son el balance de masas, que yo he visto que se han utilizado en el pasado. Yo, con experiencias anteriores trabajando para la industria, con un simple balance de masa se han detectado casos de fraude muy importantes. No puede un retailer vender uno solo más producto con denominación de origen de lo que todo el sector puede producir, por ejemplo, ¿no? Entonces, este tipo de ejercicios también son muy económicos y muy válidos. Em, Otro proceso, o sea, otro tipo de fraude importante a destacar en nuestro sector, pues es la adición de agua y otros ingredientes a los productos, el sobreglaseado y el empanado con exceso, el uso de agentes aglutinantes de agua no declarados para aumentar el peso. Un ejemplo que traigo, pues bueno, un 50, que puede ser, un 50% de ganancia de peso en pangasius después de procesar con determinados aditivos. Em, Se dice mucho en el sector, se habla mucho en el sector, y la industria discute mucho sobre esto. Se vende agua, a veces se vende agua, y esto pues no puede ser. Es un fraude económico importante que también puede tener repercusiones en la inocuidad alimentaria si se hace de mala manera, si no se tienen en cuenta determinados procesos. Y hay herramientas como la técnicas de inspección visual, que son muy útiles, y también otras técnicas más costosas como la medición de factores de nitrógeno, entre otras que se pueden utilizar para combatir este tipo de fraude. Por último, y muy importante, porque además esto lo estamos viendo cada vez más, es la introducción de sustancias que puedan ocultar alteraciones en el producto, ocultan en ocasiones fases de putrefacción. El monóxido de carbono, por ejemplo, pues se tiende a utilizar más y más para mejorar el aspecto, sobre todo el color, en algunos productos, y puede ser añadido durante el proceso de congelado. Está prohibido en la mayoría de los países, pero se utiliza porque luego se ven a lo largo de los procesos de inspección, y puede tener implicaciones serias para la inocuidad alimentaria. Es, bueno, se detecta fácilmente con técnicas analíticas como la cromatografía, y lo hemos visto mucho en el sector del atún últimamente. Con esto ya termino. Yo solamente quería destacar algunos de los casos más comunes de fraude y dar algunas herramientas que están disponibles ahí, ideas para las autoridades competentes para combatirlos, y quedo disponible para cualquier tipo de preguntas que tenga la audiencia. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Esther, por la presentación. Tenemos el micrófono abierto nuevamente para quienes quieran hacer alguna consulta. Por favor, ahí, con confianza. La idea es que este espacio
Aló,
sea lo más... Adelante, adelante. No sé quién está hablando, pero adelante.
aló, buen día. Soy
Carolina,
Carolina
adelante.
Tejerina. Es que no tengo la manito para levantar, así es que
No hay
a ver si
problema,
uso de la
adelante.
palabra. Bien, muy importante la exposición que acaba de ejecutarse. Sin embargo, la información es muy amplia, de manera más específica para pescado fresco. Entonces, en Bolivia todavía tenemos una alta importación en lo que respecta a enlatados de pescado, y uno de los enlatados de pescado más famosos, o digamos así, o más apetecible por el consumidor popular, es la sardina. Sin embargo, tenemos el antecedente de que inicialmente nuestro principal proveedor era Chile, ya no pudo abastecer la demanda con la sardina. Y, no, no es sardina, es jurel. Corrijo, por favor, es jurel. y entonces han tenido que comprar de otro país, ¿no? Utilizando la misma marca y esos detalles. Entonces, con este antecedente, mi pregunta es, ¿qué recomendaciones nos podrían brindar respecto al pescado como tal, pero en este caso enlatados de pescado, ¿no? Para nosotros ir tomando alguna acción como autoridad sanitaria para poder evitar este tema que el ejemplo más cercano que podemos tomar es el tema de la sustitución de especies, que es algo que nos está llamando bastante la atención. ¿Qué recomendaciones nos daría para este tipo de productos como son los enlatados de pescado?
Muchas gracias, Carolina. Pues básicamente técnicas basadas en el ADN, porque claro, los productos enlatados ya llegan pues, y con una inspección visual, pues sería difícil. En ocasiones están completamente desmenuzados y demás, con lo cual nos queda pues eso, la técnica más a la que más se recurre es ADN para este tipo de pescados. Técnicas organolépticas puede ser, mm, pero para mayor seguridad yo diría técnicas analíticas basadas en el ADN.
Gracias, muy amable.
A usted.
Muchas gracias. ¿Alguna otra consulta para nuestra panelista? Bueno, muchas gracias nuevamente, Esther, por acompañarnos el día de hoy y por toda la información y conocimientos entregados a la región. Muchas gracias.
Gracias a
Entonces, sí,
vosotros.
seguimos adelante con nuestro tercer panelista, Evelyn. La palabra es tuya.
Listo. Muchas gracias, Esther. Muy interesante la presentación. Igual a Eleonora, que no pude agradecerle antes por el micrófono. Bueno, vamos con nuestro tercer panelista. Él es Teemu Vinnikainen, quien trabaja como consultor jurídico internacional en el Servicio de Derecho para el Desarrollo de la Organización de las Naciones Unidas para la Alimentación y la Agricultura, FAO, desde 2016. Sus amplios intereses y responsabilidades incluyen el fraude alimentario, la resistencia a los antimicrobianos, la pérdida y el desperdicio de alimentos, la agricultura por contrato y, en general, temas relacionados con la alimentación, así como la sanidad animal y vegetal y la producción. Antes de prestar sus servicios a la FAO, también ha trabajado en la Oficina Jurídica de Fondo Internacional de Desarrollo Agrícola, FIDA, y en el Instituto Internacional para la Unificación del Derecho Privado, UNIDROIT. Él es licenciado en Derecho por la Universidad de Turku. Teemu, les dejamos con su presentación, por favor. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Evelyn, for the introduction. I will share my screen for the third and the final presentation for the afternoon. So if you can just confirm that you can see my screen, and I will then get going. So, as mentioned, I am Teemu Viinikainen. I'm a legal consultant with the Development Law Service here at the headquarters of FAO in Rome. And I will be moving on to a different angle I will be moving on a different angle on the question on food fraud, and we will be approaching it from the legislative regulatory perspective. So we will be looking at some common legal aspects that surrounds this issue. As we have seen in the previous two excellent presentations from my colleagues, we are now dealing with the dark underbelly of our agri-food systems. We're no longer talking about people who all have the same objective of providing good and safe food for people. We're talking about a different set of actors. These people who are in it to cheat and deceive, they are looking for ways to game the system. They are breaking rules and cutting corners in order to make a buck for themselves. They are, unfortunately, as we saw in the previous presentation on the different fraud cases in fish, very creative when it comes to finding ways to to deceive the consumer on what they're actually supposed to be getting. And ultimately, what they are doing is that they're trying to sell you stuff you didn't want. They are selling you something and claiming it as something else. Simply put, they are fraudsters. And in my brief presentation now, I will tread a little bit on some of the topics that were already introduced, but I want to drill in on the foundations of those legal systems without cracks that were discussed in the previous presentation and see what that could look like for the case of food fraud, both at the international level and then, more importantly, at the national level. What can national regulators do to respond to food fraud? A little bit of context. This is already familiar to you from Eleonora's excellent first presentation. Food fraud is not a new issue. As mentioned, it is as old as agri-food systems themselves, but there are these cases, these high-profile cases from the last 10 or 15 years or so that have brought this topic back on the agenda and are part of the reason why Codex is now considering a specific instrument to tackle the issue. I'm not going to spend much time on these. Eleonora already introduced essentially all of the examples I had as well, because these are some of the cornerstone ones that have led to this new enthusiasm on the topic. But I do want to drill home this point that even if food fraud as a term is relatively simple to understand, it is a fraud that has to do with food. In practice, the problem is incredibly complex. The different ways in which various actors and fraudsters are defrauding the system are multitude. There are as many ways of committing food fraud as there are those who want to do it, as there are fraudsters. And on the topic of fraudsters, I wanted to spend a few words to try to paint a little bit of a picture on who are the likely or potential perpetrators of food fraud in the agri-food system. There are the usual suspects. There are the various individual actors within a agri-food supply chain, the different buyers, the different traders, food business organizations that might have both the willingness and the capacity to do fraudulent actions. A category of fraudsters that is not as commonly discussed, but that we have been learning in the recent years plays a major part in the story is organized crime. A lot of organized crime units, groups around the world have been shifting their focus to food fraud as either a source to launder the money they get from their other illicit operations, or simply realizing the fact that there is a lot of money to be made in fraudulent food, but there's relatively small penalties if you get caught. So they may be able to reach similar levels of profits as with some other forms of crimes, some drug-related smuggling. But if they get caught, they usually get an administrative fine rather than years and years in prison. So organized crime is another major player in food fraud. Some food supply chains, some agri-food supply chains are more vulnerable to this phenomenon than others. Generally speaking, the longer and more complex a supply chain is, and the more valuable the underlying product is, the more opportunities there are for fraud, as well as a motivation, because the economic gain that could be garnered might be higher. And this explains, for example, why spices tend to be on a commonly fraudulent list of products. Fish tends to be on the list of products like we learned in the previous presentation. But regardless of the supply chain, regardless of whether we're talking about an individual actor, whether we're talking about an organized crime group, there's essentially three characteristics that needs to be filled for someone to be able to participate in food fraud. First of all, they need to be willing to perform fraud. Most of us, luckily, are not, but there's always that small subset of people that are willing to game the system for their own benefit. Second, they need to have access to the supply chain. They need to be able to manipulate the food items in one way or another to gain that economic benefit that they're looking for. And three, they need to have the knowledge to actually carry out the operation. This means both the knowledge how to manipulate the food, as well as the knowledge how to do it without instantly getting caught. Because if they get caught instantly, the problem of food fraud is much less serious than it currently is. The effects we've already seen in the specific case of fish, and more generally in the first presentation from Eleonora. But just as a quick recap, food fraud carries both direct health risks to consumers. If you don't know what you're eating, there's always a chance that it's going to hurt you, either because the food itself is objectively dangerous. It has melamine, it has fipronil, it has some other added ingredients that are just objectively dangerous, or because it contains ingredients that aren't necessarily dangerous, but you yourself are sensitive or allergic to those. And absent accurate labeling, absent accurate information on what you are consuming, the consumer's health may always be at risk. The second type of damage that food fraud does is economic. It hurts the consumers who pay more than they should pay for the food that they are purchasing. It hurts the competitors who cannot compete with these fraudsters who are cutting corners, and they are not competing on the same playing field. And ultimately, it starts to hurt the trust that people have in their government's ability to keep their food safe. If the governments and private sector aren't able to tackle food fraud, and more of these cases start to emerge, consumers will start to lose trust, lose faith, and this can have a wide-reaching consequences. While there's, of course, a variety of methods and approaches that can be used to tackle food fraud, today I want to emphasize the role that legislation has in both preventing as well as controlling food fraud. Legislation coupled with strong institutions. And as food fraud tends to be global due to the globalization of agri-food chains, also the response may need to be global and require this kind of collaboration between the various national authorities of different countries to come together and look for ways to work together to counter food fraud, as well as set up these kinds of international instruments like Codex is currently doing, that gives the framework for actions down the line. From a legal perspective, we recognize the fact that at the moment, there are no internationally accepted legal definitions for food fraud. Codex is working on one, and we saw that in Eleonora's presentation. But until such time as that may be adopted in the relatively near future, what we have been doing instead is we've tried to identify the different elements that underlie this phenomena and use those to categorize actions as food fraud. Here on the screen, you can see these three elements that are also present in the proposed definition by the Codex. Intentionality. If you accidentally misrepresent something, you're not committing a fraud, you're making an accident. Deception. If you are not deceiving anyone with whatever you are doing, you are not committing a fraud. You may be unclear, you may be committing some administrative offenses, but you're not defrauding. And you also need to be making an unfair advantage, most usually economic, for yourself. When these three elements, intentionality, deception, and unfair advantage, are present in an individual action or a set of actions, we consider this to be an incident of food fraud. These elements are wide enough that they cover both cases of food fraud that are related to the product itself. In addition to the examples of fishes that we just saw, one can think of a substitution of a hazelnut instead of olives to provide olive oil. But the elements also cover the process through which food is created, which may also be fraudulently represented for economic gain, naturally done intentionally. And here, for example, the example we often use is Parmigiano cheese. Parmigiano cheese can be sold with different levels of maturation, such, for example, ripened for 24 months, but rather I ripened it for 6 months and I just claim it's 24. I save a lot of money by not having to do that 2-year process, and I rather do a half-a-year one, but I still get paid for the claims that I make, even though they are fraudulent. And it's always good to remind, it's not just money. It will very often, unfortunately, harm people consuming these products at the end of the chain. Here we have some examples of food fraud that are necessarily exactly the same as the ones that are making to the Codex document. But this just goes to show what I was saying earlier about the complexity of this issue. The variety of frauds that can take place is mind-boggling. There are some simple ones, adulteration, where you add or remove something to a food product. Tampering, mislabeling, you claim that your fish is another fish just by changing the label and writing the name of another fish on it. There are some more complicated ones, process-related ones, such as overproduction, where you go above the amount of production that you are legally or contractually allowed to do, and then you use that overproduction to flood a separate market or the same market. Theft can pose a form of food fraud where you steal food and then you try to sell it off as a legitimate one. You are again intentionally deceiving people from the origin of the food and your right to sell it for a economic gain. Diversion, you take food that is supposed to go to, let's say, a relief effort in a country in conflict situation, and you instead try to sell it at a separate market for your own benefit. In the case of simulation, you make a knockoff version, a similar version to a famous food product with just some minor little differences, and you try to trick people into thinking that it's the same. Or you can counterfeit, in which case you make a exact copy of a packaging of a food product, but inside there is your own inferior product. These are just examples of the vast universe of types of food fraud that there are. Now to move on to the substance or the more substantive parts of my presentation, where I first want to talk a little bit about the current legal framework and then specifically the different regulatory strategies that we have seen countries do nationally. At the moment, Codex is working on those very famous guidelines on food fraud that we have heard a lot today. But in addition to those, there are already a variety of existing documents and guidance material from Codex that would be applicable to certain aspects of food fraud. The ones that we quote here include the Code of Ethics for International Trade in Food, but there are also a number of others that cover different aspects of food control systems. Another instrument that plays a major role, even though none of these are specifically created with food fraud in mind, is the agreement on the application of sanitary and phytosanitary measures from the World Trade Organization, which places some outer limits and frameworks for the ways in which food is traded internationally. UNIDROIT principles and the United Nations Convention on Contracts for the International Sale of Goods are two international instruments that govern the contracts that are used in international trade. These offer a less used avenue of tackling food fraud, with the understanding that if you are operating in a commercial setting, and meaning that you are most likely entering into a contract to supply somebody with something, and that something is fraudulent, these different kinds of international frameworks for contract law have different approaches to deal with this misrepresentation of the underlying goods. And since food fraud does, in many cases, have an effect on the consumers, the international frameworks for consumer protection, such as the guidelines from the United Nations from the 1985, may find some applicability. But none of these are specifically on food fraud. They can offer some support for some aspects. The Codex Alimentarius path I'll skip because that was very comprehensively covered, and we can move directly to discussing the situation at the national level. The first finding that we have seen in our research into the legal realm of food fraud is that essentially in every jurisdiction that we have looked into, the practice of food fraud would be prohibited through one method or another. Very rarely would this method be a definition of a crime of food fraud or an offense of food fraud. Rather, the practice of food fraud would fall under the different regulatory areas that I will go over in a bit. This doesn't mean that the topic is well covered. This doesn't mean that the work is done, but it does mean that in principle, food fraud is already a prohibited practice. But since we know that it's common, arguably getting increasingly common, it is clear that something new needs to be done, something additional needs to be found to tackle the issue. And this something new, something additional could come from any of these topics, any of these strategies that we have identified in our recent publications. A common approach, and one we've been discussing today the most, is to rely on food safety and quality legislation, because the explicit purpose of that realm of legislation is to make sure that the food is safe and it is of good quality. The ways in which food safety and quality legislation may fail is that they often assume that everyone shares the interest in making sure that food is safe. And they aren't necessarily equipped to deal with scenarios where actors are intentionally trying to get around the rules, not to create unsafe food, just to create themselves an economic advantage. Consumer protection legislation as well provides an avenue. This, with the understanding that consumers' health or otherwise their interests may be harmed through food fraud. Limitation here is that this would only be applicable to cases of food fraud that affect consumers. This is not the only interface where food fraud happens. Throughout the whole supply chain between the different businesses, the same incidents of fraud may happen over and over again without anyone noticing. And only when it comes to a consumer level and someone gets sick or worse, it becomes clear. But the fraud itself has been perpetrated throughout the supply chain, and consumer protection legislation can only tackle it when consumer interests are at hand. Contract law at the international level, I already touched, but the main idea at national level is the same. Food fraud would almost always be also a fraud in the sense that the underlying contract has been entered through a fraudulent declaration, for which there are various options that can be used to remedy. food fraud is also fraud. And fraud is one of the few human activities that I would hazard to say is universally a crime. I've yet to find a criminal law that does not criminalize fraud. And at least in those cases where the food fraud is serious enough that it fulfills the definition of fraud in a criminal law, it would be considered as such and be subject to enforcement under the criminal code, leading to whatever happens to be the process and punishment for performing fraud. That being said, not all aspects, not all incidents of food fraud would necessarily fulfill the criminal law definition of fraud, but they still may be administrative offenses, and countries' administrative laws may have approaches to cover them. And finally, as mentioned before, since food fraud has been with us since the beginning of agriculture, it has been evolving with the times. Whenever there is a new avenue for commerce, there's a new avenue for fraud. And an example of this is the increasing importance of e-commerce or selling food online, which is providing new opportunities for fraud, but it's also providing a new opportunities for governments who are still trying to figure out how to tackle the topic of e-commerce to bake into the system measures that could be used to protect consumers and other actors against fraud. And finally, it's not only the job of the government to establish these kinds of normative frameworks that provide the backbone for actions against food fraud. Private sector has a major role to play. And private sector can either go at it alone, they can adopt self-regulation, codes of conduct, different kind of corporate initiatives in which they come together and set themselves some rules that are supposed to deter food fraud from taking place. When government is involved in these activities, it's called co-regulation. But whether or not it's done by the industry alone or industry with the support of the government, the role that the private sector has and the interest that the private sector has in self-policing is high. It may need some support from the public side to make sure that the rules that come out of the system are both effective against food fraud while still respecting the fairness of competition otherwise, without locking in the power of the more powerful players. So those are the high-level legal strategies, the different avenues that countries have been using to tackle this issue. And I want to finish with the last two slides, where I just give a few more concrete things that legislation can do and the way that it can affect the food fraud. And the first one is related to what Codex is doing, and it's about the importance of the definition of food fraud as a phenomena into itself. Like I mentioned already, food fraud would be a prohibited practice in everywhere that we've looked so far. But if a definition for a food fraud were to be adopted, it does a number of things. First, it focuses attention on this phenomena. It gets access to more resources. It allows to create specific solutions that are drafted specifically for targeting food fraud, rather than relying on solutions that are originally used to make sure the food is safe, make sure that consumers are protected, make sure that e-commerce runs smoothly, and gives us something that is specifically targeting food fraud itself. And as a public outreach and enforcement issue, it shows the seriousness of food fraud as an offense. Another one that we've been exploring a lot, another approach, is to mandate food business operators to conduct vulnerability assessments against fraud within their own operations. Already a number of food safety and quality legislation does the same for food safety and quality. You need to assess your own production chain to see which are the weak points where food safety might be endangered. And a similar approach to food fraud would help private businesses themselves to strengthen them, harden them against food fraud. And if countries were to align their national legislation on food safety and quality with the recommendations from Codex Alimentarios, this helps in building the kind of bedstone of a regulatory framework that creates resilience against food fraud, even if it's not specifically on it. And here we have just the reminder of the role of the consumer protection legislation and the possibility of, when tackling a new topic like e-commerce through regulatory measures, to bake in those considerations of food fraud in it. My last two thoughts are quite simple, but nevertheless very important. We are painfully aware that legislation is only as good as its enforcement. It doesn't really matter how good your definition of food fraud is. It doesn't really matter how well drafted provisions you have mandating food business operations to undertake vulnerability assessments if you lack the capacity to control the compliance of the various actors. And second, national context is always the key. Everything that I have been talking about in my short presentation needs to be adapted to the country in question. There's no silver bullet. There's no one way of doing this. What works well in another country might be a complete disaster in another one. So everything will always need to be understood within the entirety of the legal framework of the country and adapted to seamlessly fit into it if it is to have a chance to curb food fraud. But that's what I had prepared. My contact information is there. I'm happy to be reached out through email, and I'm also happy to answer any questions that you might have at this stage as well. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Muchas gracias, Temu, por su excelente participación. Damos paso al público para que puedan realizar sus preguntas a nuestro exponente.
Hola.
Lorena, sí.
Hola, sí, disculpa. Quería hacerle una consulta a Temu respecto a cuáles serían como sus recomendaciones o el enfoque que él considera más apropiado para combatir el fraude alimentario, considerando que existen asociaciones criminales, que esto de repente tiene un enfoque que va más allá de lo que compete a los servicios, a las autoridades de control de alimentos. ¿Cuál sería como una estrategia más adecuada según su opinión para un país que está partiendo en esta materia?
Excellent question. When it comes to the participation of organized crime in food fraud, it indeed tends to bring this topic out from the purview of purely food safety and quality authorities, and it brings it to the purview of the criminal enforcement, the police, the prosecutors. So for a country that is starting to tackle this issue, I would recommend to look for ways in which the collaboration between food safety and quality authorities is matched with the authority of the police and the prosecutor and the others who are dealing with the criminal enforcement in the country. This isn't, I mean, the better this collaboration works, the easier it is for the food safety authorities, who are more likely to be the ones who detect the case of food fraud, to then forward them to the appropriate criminal enforcement officials, who may be the correct authorities to deal with these cases, particularly when there is an element of organized crime. But yes, ultimately it would depend on establishing these collaborations, whether through the way which is established would depend on the national context, but it is this interplay between food safety authorities and those responsible for enforcing the criminal law, police and prosecution, that is crucial when the aspect of organized crime and food fraud as a crime is considered.
Okay, thank you very much.
Perfecto, muchas gracias, Temu. Tenemos otra pregunta que nos la enviaron por interno, que dice así: tomando en cuenta que este tema del fraude alimentario aún no se lo ha abordado con la suficiente profundidad en Bolivia, ¿qué recomendaciones nos brindaría para abordarlo con la mayor responsabilidad y evitar minimizar la importancia de este tema, que en varios casos puede afectar también la salud del consumidor? Pueden responderlo cualquiera de los tres panelistas.
I'm happy to start, but my answer will be rather generic. Not being familiar, and I will be limited to the regulatory perspective. If it is the case in Bolivia that you have found that the current system isn't necessarily sufficient to tackle food fraud, from a regulatory perspective, the first step would be to do a mapping of the existing legal framework to see what are all the tools that are available, then understand whether these tools and powers that the legislation establishes have been used, and if they have been used and they are found to be insufficient, to then try to understand and identify further regulatory strategies that might be used for tackling this issue. But ultimately, this comes down to my point about the national context and the requirement to understand very well the situation before committing to a specific solution.
I would add that it is also important to clarify if the case is purely quality, food quality and economic gain issue, or there is also food safety risk associated, because it may be that the fish has been cultured in unclear, let's say, environment, in unclear waters, and it may be polluted, it may be contaminated. So it is important to have some monitoring and to take samples from the consignment, which is from those, let's say, consignments which are tracked to be coming from this illicit traded food. So it's important to have some additional evidence to link the risk of this for public health or food safety. So it's necessary to to accumulate the evidence, to study the issue from different angles, from monetary angles, from financial angles, from also damage to consumer, also weighing, for example, how much they pay for a claim species instead of what is in reality sold. And as I mentioned, linking this surveillance, public health surveillance with monitoring of this value chain or supply chain of fish, of let's say, not very suspected, let's say, fish. Thank you.
Perfecto, muchas gracias, Temu y Eleonora. Tenemos una pregunta más. ¿Sí? ¿Alguien más? No.
Hay una pregunta en el chat de Rosa María
Sí.
Curí. Dice, si podrían volver a recalcar los tipos de fraude alimentario. Asimismo, si este tema en otros países es sancionable y de seguimiento solamente por la fiscalía o policía, o también lo sanciona el sector de salud.
I'm happy to jump in at least for the latter half of the question. As far as we have seen so far, the food fraud has tended to fall under the health sector's remit, but there are a number of countries that are moving towards prosecuting for food fraud offenses. Very good example that I can give is United Kingdom, that has a national food crime unit that is dedicated to issues of food crime, including food fraud. And they, as the name implies, are taking a more prosecutorial approach. But as far as I'm aware, food fraud tends to still be viewed more through the angle of food safety authorities rather than as a crime and punishable as such.
I know countries where food fraud is considered, for example, any deviation from the labeling and from the specifications. For example, if in cafeterias, for example, especially in the workplace cafeterias, there are usually, for example, in the organized meal, in school meals, for example, if usually the portions are standardized, and for example, it is standardized the weight of the main part of the meat part, the weight of the garnish. And if there are food control and they establish that the real distribution of food do not comply with the standard set in the menu, in this case, they are also punishable for this is considered as cheating to consumer, and it is punishable in fiscal terms. Is this one example which you can think about others similar?
Igual, María, puedo responder a la primera parte de la pregunta.
Adelante, gracias.
Porque nos preguntaban bueno, cuáles son los tipos de fraude alimentario. Y la realidad es que hay muchísimas clasificaciones de fraude. Una de las más conocidas es clasificarlo en fraude comercial o fraude sanitario. Pero también hay otros tipos de clasificaciones que son pues, fraude intencional o fraude no intencionado. Y luego hay clasificaciones que van más allá, en función, digamos, de la categoría técnica de fraude, pues sí es eh, adulteración o simulación, es un producto por otro, o robo. Se roban productos, luego se entra en el canal legal, vamos a decirlo así. Em, entonces, decir, ¿cómo se clasifica el fraude? Bueno, o sea, hay muchos modos de clasificarlo, ¿vale? Pero diría que sobre todo fraude comercial y fraude sanitario y intencional y no intencional. A veces la gente comete fraude y no sabe que está cometiendo fraudes por desconocimiento. En el sector de la pesca pasa mucho por el tema del mal etiquetado. Muchas veces etiquetan mal por desconocimiento de la taxonomía, por poner un ejemplo. Gracias.
I can bring also examples of substitution. For example, in food service, there is also the food control. They can take samples and check if the butter was substituted with other fats. And this is considered, of course, substitution is a kind of food fraud and it is punishable. Or, for example, dilution of water, of milk with water, which is very, let's say, common in different countries. Also, it's a type of fraud, and dilution is also. So, as mentioned by my colleague Esther, indeed, every country will have to reflect in their national legislation what type of fraud the national food control authorities can look at and have to look at, and respectively to elaborate a set of sanctions depending of the type of risk and the gravity of consequences of the food fraud.
Perfecto. Muchas gracias. Agradecemos nuevamente a nuestros panelistas y participantes en esta excelente jornada. En honor al tiempo vamos a cerrar el evento. Antes de irnos, les pido por favor a todos nuestros participantes encender sus cámaras para poder tomar una foto.
Sonrían que aquí vamos con la primera. Tenemos a muchos participantes hoy día, así que un poco de paciencia. Listo. Muchísimas gracias entonces a todos. Podríamos estar conversando mucho rato sobre este tema tan interesante, pero en honor al tiempo lo dejamos. Thank you very much, our panelists too. Y también, por supuesto, a nuestros intérpretes. Y nos seguimos viendo en esta serie de webinarios. Muchas gracias, que estén muy bien, cuídense.